The night my son disappeared, the world stopped making sense. I still remember the way the cicadas screamed in the summer air, the way his small hand slipped from mine for just a moment, one short, ordinary moment, before everything shattered. It was 1988 in Sichuan, and I was just another mother hanging laundry while my little boy played outside our home. He had this habit of chasing dragonflies near the courtyard wall. That evening, he ran after one, laughing, his voice echoing through the alley. That was the last time I heard him laugh. When I realized he was gone, it was as if my lungs forgot how to breathe. I called his name until my throat bled. Neighbors joined in, searching the narrow streets, the markets, the riverbanks. Someone said they saw a man leading a small boy by the hand near the bus stop, but no one remembered the man's face. The local police came hours later. They told me not to panic, that children wander off all the time. He'll come home soon, they said. But I knew, a mother always knows when something is truly wrong. Days turned into weeks. I barely slept. Every morning, I went to the train station and asked travelers if they'd seen a boy with a scar above his eyebrow, the scar he got from falling off his tricycle. I printed black and white flyers at a local shop, using the only photo I had of him smiling. I taped them on every wall, pole, and market stall I could find. Some people pitied me. Others avoided me, as if grief were contagious. But I didn't care. The police eventually stopped calling. They told me there was no solid lead. They said I should accept the possibility that he might never be found. But how do you accept that? How do you eat when you don't know if your child is hungry somewhere? How do you sleep not knowing if he's alive? Every night, I replayed that moment, the sound of his laughter fading into silence, and wished I could go back. As months passed, I realized this wasn't just my tragedy. Around that time, stories started spreading, whispers of other families in nearby towns whose children had vanished just as suddenly. The same pattern, a distracted parent, a child gone in seconds, no trace. The newspapers rarely mentioned it. The authorities brushed it off as isolated incidents. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. Something much larger was happening, something no one wanted to see. That summer marked the beginning of my life as a mother without rest. I stopped counting the days and started counting the flyers I printed, hundreds, then thousands. I carried his picture everywhere. I boarded buses to cities I'd never been to, following rumors, chasing shadows. I told myself that somewhere, someone had seen him. That maybe he was waiting for me to find him. What I didn't know then was that my story was only one among hundreds of thousands, that my search would stretch across decades, and that the disappearance of my son was part of a far darker truth hidden beneath the surface of our country. The search became my life. In the months after my son vanished, I quit my job at the factory and used every bit of savings to keep looking. People told me to stop, to let time heal. But time doesn't heal when you don't know the ending. It only deepens the wound. Every sunrise was another reminder that he was still out there, somewhere, waiting for me to find him. I started small. I printed flyers by hand, one photo, one desperate plea, and pasted them on telephone poles, bus stops, and school gates. At first, I counted them, 100, 1,000, 10,000. Then I stopped counting because numbers no longer mattered. My world had shrunk to one goal, finding my boy. I learned to live on instant noodles and cold water, to sleep sitting up in train stations, to talk to strangers without fear or shame. Whenever I heard of a child found wandering or a boy fitting his age seen somewhere, I went. No matter how far, no matter how faint the rumor. Some nights, I found myself in towns where no one spoke my dialect. I would hold his photo up and ask, "Have you seen this child?" Over and over. Most people would shake their heads, some would walk away quickly. Others, usually mothers, would stop, touch my arm, and whisper, "I'm still looking too." That's how I met others like me. We started sharing stories, exchanging numbers written on scraps of paper. I wasn't alone anymore. The years blurred together. I wore the same faded jacket, the one with his picture pinned to the front, so everyone could see. My hair went gray, my hands cracked from the winters spent outside train stations handing out flyers. Sometimes the police would tell me to leave, that I was disturbing the peace. But I couldn't stop. When you're a mother searching for your child, you stop caring about rules, pride, or exhaustion. There were moments when hope almost broke me. Once, I received a call from someone claiming they'd seen a boy who looked just like my son in Henan. I traveled 2 days straight by bus, my heart pounding the whole way. When I arrived, I found a child standing by a stall, same eyes, same scar above the brow. But when he looked up, I knew it wasn't him. His mother was right there beside him, holding his hand. I smiled, thanked them, and walked away before they could see me cry. Years later, my story began appearing in small newspapers. "The Mother Who Never Stopped Searching," one headline read. People would approach me on the street, saying they'd seen my posters or wanted to help. Some handed me money for bus fare, others simply offered a place to sleep for the night. Every act of kindness reminded me that humanity still existed, even in the darkest places. Over the decades, I put up more than 100,000 flyers. Each one carried the same photo, a smiling boy with bright eyes and messy hair, and the same question: "Have you seen my son?" I started traveling across provinces, from Sichuan to Guangdong, from Yunnan to Beijing. The roads became my home. I had no address anymore, only a purpose. I told myself that every flyer, every conversation, every step was bringing me closer to him. But what I didn't know is that my search was leading me towards something much bigger, a hidden tragedy that stretched far beyond my own loss. Thousands of other parents were searching too, their stories echoing mine. We were all chasing ghosts in a country that didn't want to admit how many of its children had disappeared. For years, I believed my son's disappearance was a terrible twist of fate, a cruel, isolated tragedy. But as my search carried me farther from home, I started to see the truth. I wasn't alone. At every train station, in every crowded market, there were parents like me, mothers clutching photos, fathers carrying tattered folders filled with reports, all looking for children who had vanished just as suddenly as mine. Some had been searching for months, others for decades. We would exchange pictures and names like trading sacred relics. "Maybe you've seen him? Maybe she passed through your town?" The questions were always the same, and so were the answers: a quiet shake of the head, a heavy silence. That was when I began to understand the scale of what was happening. It wasn't just one missing child. It was tens of thousands. Some experts said the number could be as high as 200,000 children disappearing every single year in China. Many were never seen again. At first, the newspapers refused to publish the figures, too alarming, too politically sensitive. But the rumors spread anyway, whispered between families like ours who had nothing left to lose. I remember sitting in a small roadside tea shop one afternoon, resting my feet after walking for miles. Across from me sat another mother, her face sunburned and lined from years of searching. Her daughter had been taken from a park in Shandong 3 years earlier. "They sell them," she told me quietly. "They sell our children to other families. Some to factories, some even to begging rings." I wanted to deny it, to believe that the world couldn't possibly be that cruel. But the more I listened, the more the pieces began to fit together. There were patterns. Most children were taken from rural towns, where law enforcement was weak and families poor. Many of the missing were boys, valuable because of the traditional preference for male heirs. In other cases, it was infant girls, stolen and sold to childless couples desperate for a baby after the one-child policy took hold. What began as isolated kidnappings had quietly become an underground industry. I learned that traffickers operated like networks, spotters in villages, transporters moving children across provinces, and corrupt officials willing to forge new household registration papers, known as hukou. Once a child had new documents, they were legally someone else's son or daughter. Parents like me could search for a lifetime and never find them. The more I discovered, the angrier I became. We had been told to stay silent, to trust the authorities, but it was clear the system had failed us. Most police stations lacked the resources or the will to investigate. Some even hinted that it was our fault, that we should have been watching our children more closely. That was the cruelest part of it all, the quiet blame that came with the loss. As I continued my search, I started collecting stories, writing down names, dates, and locations of missing children. By the time I filled my first notebook, I had over 100 entries. Every name represented another shattered family, another mother wandering train platforms at midnight, another father waiting outside a police office that never called back. It became painfully clear that my story was just a thread in a vast web of suffering. And behind that web was a truth few dared to speak aloud, that in the heart of a growing nation, an entire generation of stolen children had become invisible. To understand why so many children disappeared, you have to go back to the late 1970s, when China introduced the one-child policy. At the time, the country was struggling with overpopulation and poverty, and the government believed that limiting each family to a single child would secure its economic future. It sounded logical on paper, but no one could have predicted the quiet devastation it would unleash inside homes across the nation. In rural China, especially, families had always depended on sons. Sons carried the family name, worked the fields, and cared for their parents in old age. Daughters, though loved, would eventually marry and belong to another household. The policy turned that ancient belief into a cruel dilemma. Families who gave birth to girls were pressured, fined, or forced to give them up. Those who wanted boys, but couldn't conceive again, started looking for another way, and that's where the trafficking began. By the 1980s, a black market for children had quietly taken root. On one side were couples desperate for a child, unable to have more under the law. On the other were traffickers who saw opportunity in desperation. A stolen child could sell for thousands of yuan, a small fortune in the countryside. Some were kidnapped from playgrounds or markets. Others were sold by relatives who had no means to raise them. In certain cases, local officials looked the other way. As long as the paperwork appeared clean, the problem didn't exist. I didn't understand all this when my son vanished. Back then, I thought he'd simply been taken by a cruel stranger. But years later, when I began talking to other families, the pattern became impossible to ignore. Most of the missing children were from poor or rural backgrounds. Many were boys around the same age. And in almost every case, the police were slow to act. Reports were lost, investigations went cold, and parents were left begging for updates that never came. I met a man in Guizhou who told me he'd spent 5 years searching for his twin daughters. He'd been fined for violating the policy and couldn't afford to pay. One night, the local family planning officials came to his home, and when he woke up the next morning, his daughters were gone. He never saw them again. Cases like his weren't supposed to happen, but they did, quietly, often with official silence surrounding them. The one-child policy didn't just control births, it created an imbalance of values. It made children, especially boys, a form of currency. A baby could mean financial security, family honor, or a chance to escape fines and penalties. And when something becomes currency, someone always finds a way to trade it. Decades later, as the policy finally ended, the scars it left behind remained. There were entire villages filled with aging parents and no children. Couples who had paid for adopted sons lived with guilt, unsure if the boy they raised had been taken from someone like me. And all across China, walls were covered with weathered posters, faces of missing children staring back, fading in the sun. When people ask why I never stopped searching, I tell them it's because I understood what the policy took from us. It wasn't just our children, it was the trust between families, the safety of our streets, and the right to love a child without fear of punishment. The one-child policy began as a law to control life, but for many of us, it became the reason we lost everything that made life worth living. The more I searched, the more I uncovered the machinery behind it all, an invisible network that turned stolen children into profit. It wasn't random kidnappers working alone. It was organized, layered, and shockingly efficient. The underground trade had its own routes, contacts, and middlemen, spreading across provinces like veins beneath the surface of the country. I learned this not from officials, but from whispers from other parents, from reporters brave enough to investigate, and from people who had once been part of it. There were spotters in small towns who watched for children left alone for even a few minutes. They'd make a call, and within hours someone else would arrive, a man on a motorbike, a woman posing as a relative. Once the child was taken, they'd be moved fast. Buses, trains, and even trucks carrying vegetables or coal. Within a day, a kidnapped boy from Sichuan could be in Guangdong or Fujian, far from home and impossible to trace. At the next stage were the paper fixers. These were people who could create a new identity, fake birth certificates, forged hospital records, and hukou household registration documents that made a child legally belong to another family. Sometimes they worked with corrupt local officials who would stamp the papers, no questions asked, for a bribe. Once the child had a new identity, they vanished from the system completely. To the state, they were someone else's child now. There were also buyers, couples who couldn't conceive, or those who wanted a son but were forbidden from having another child under the one-child policy. They rarely asked where the child came from. Many told themselves they were rescuing a child, not buying one. Others knew exactly what they were doing and didn't care. To them, love was ownership. I remember one mother I met in Anhui who found her daughter after 15 years. The girl had been sold to a childless couple for 20,000 yuan. By the time the police recovered her, the adoptive family had moved 3 times. They cried when she was taken away, claiming they had raised her like their own. The mother told me later, they loved her, yes, but it was love built on theft. In some cities, there were even cases where children were stolen not for families, but for labor. Boys were sold to factories, forced to work long hours for no pay. Others were sent to begging rings in large cities, their injuries deliberately inflicted to earn sympathy and money. These were the stories no one wanted to hear. They showed that this wasn't just a family issue, it was a human crisis hidden behind economic growth and silence. The traffickers thrived because people were afraid to speak. If parents accused local officials, they risked harassment or arrest. If journalists reported too much, their stories disappeared before printing. It was safer to look away. That silence gave traffickers their power. For me, understanding the system only deepened the ache. I began to see every lost child's photo differently, not just as a tragedy, but as evidence of a machine that had been running for decades. It wasn't just my son who had been stolen, it was a generation. Sometimes, late at night, I would imagine what might have happened to him. Was he given a new name? Was he told his mother abandoned him? Maybe he lived in another province, with another family who celebrated his birthdays while I searched in the dark. Those thoughts hurt the most, because they meant he might be alive, and that somewhere, he was part of the very system that tore us apart. The years turned into decades, and the search became the rhythm of my life. Every morning, I woke with the same thought: maybe today I'll find him. That hope was both my strength and my curse. It kept me moving when my legs ached, when I couldn't afford a meal, when the rain soaked through my clothes. But it also chained me to a past I could never escape. By the early 2000s, I had spent more than 10 years on the road. I'd traveled to nearly every province in China, sleeping in bus stations, on park benches, in strangers' homes. My backpack was my only constant companion, filled with flyers, old newspaper clippings, and a small box of his baby clothes I couldn't bear to leave behind. I had memorized every feature of his face, the curve of his jaw, the scar above his eyebrow, the way his left ear bent slightly forward. But with every passing year, I knew he was changing, growing up without me, becoming a stranger. That thought haunted me most. In my search, I met hundreds of other parents who shared the same pain. Some were farmers, others teachers or factory workers. Our lives had been stripped down to a single purpose. We formed small networks, meeting at train stations or crowded bus depots to exchange information. Someone would bring a newspaper clipping about a child found in another city. Someone else would mention a lead they heard from a friend of a friend. We learned to trust no one and hope for everything. Eventually, we organized ourselves into a group. We called it the Searching Families. There was no leader, no money, just a shared desperation. We traveled together when we could, supported each other when the grief became too heavy. I still remember an old father from Hebei who carried a binder filled with photos of missing children. "If I can't find my son," he said, "maybe I'll help someone else find theirs." That became our quiet rule, to never walk away from another parent's pain. There were moments of cruel hope, false leads, mistaken identities, rumors that turned into nothing. Once, I spent my last bit of money to reach a small town after hearing about a boy who matched my son's description. When I arrived, I realized the story had been exaggerated. The boy was much younger, unrelated. I smiled for his parents and walked away, heartbroken, starting all over again. As the internet grew, we discovered online forums and message boards. We posted photos of our children, shared tips, and warned each other about scams. Later, social media became a lifeline. Platforms like Weibo and QQ were filled with posts from searching parents. Our pain was no longer invisible. The world was beginning to see us. Still, the years left their marks. My hair turned silver, my body weaker. Some parents I'd known since the early years passed away without ever finding their children. When that happened, we would hold small memorials, not funerals, because we refused to believe their children were gone, just prayers that their search might continue somehow. By then, I had been looking for over 30 years. I'd walked through cities glowing with new skyscrapers and through villages that looked frozen in time. Everywhere I went, I saw posters like mine, faces of missing children fading under layers of sun and rain. Each one felt like a mirror of my own loss. People sometimes asked how I kept going. The truth is, I didn't know how to stop. The search had become who I was. Without it, I didn't know what was left of me. Somewhere out there, my son was living a life he was never meant to have, and as long as I was breathing, I had to believe that one day, our paths would cross again. For decades, we had searched with nothing but faded photographs and broken memories. But as technology began to reshape China, something changed. For the first time, parents like me had a new kind of hope, one that didn't rely on luck or word of mouth. It came from screens, from data, from the quiet miracle of science. I still remember when I first heard about the National DNA Database Project. It was around 2015. A volunteer from Beijing told me that police were collecting DNA samples from parents of missing children, trying to match them with unidentified or adopted individuals across the country. At first, I didn't believe it. After years of false promises and lost reports, it sounded too good to be true. But a part of me, the part that had refused to give up for 32 years, told me I had to try. I traveled 2 provinces away to give my blood sample. The clinic was small, crowded with parents like me. Some held photos, others just clutched each other's hands. We stood in silence as technicians drew our blood, each of us wondering if this would be the moment that finally ended our nightmare. The nurse told me gently, "If there's a match, we'll call." Those words stayed with me for years. I carried them like a prayer. Around that time, the internet became a powerful weapon in our fight. Platforms like Baby Come Home and Bao Bei Huijia began connecting parents, volunteers, and police officers. People could upload photos, details, even age-progressed images of missing children. I learned to navigate these platforms late at night in internet cafes, scrolling through hundreds of faces, hoping one might be his. Sometimes I'd stop on a photo, my heart racing, convinced it was him, only to realize the birth year or location didn't match. Still, I kept searching. Then came social media. Apps like WeChat and Weibo gave our stories a voice. We were no longer nameless parents wandering in silence. We were a movement. Volunteers started using facial recognition technology to compare old photos of missing children with government databases, school records, and even traffic camera footage. There were success stories too, children reunited with parents after 20, 25, even 30 years. Every time I saw a reunion video, I wept. Not just from sadness, but from a strange mix of envy and relief. Their happiness reminded me that miracles were still possible. I began meeting with tech volunteers, young people who called themselves the digital detectives. They believed every lost child could be found with the right tools. They taught me how to use online archives, how to update my son's information, and how to submit DNA samples directly to regional police labs. For the first time in years, I felt like I was part of something bigger than grief. I was part of a fight. But technology also brought new pain. Every notification, every email could be the one, or just another disappointment. I learned to open messages slowly, breathing deeply before reading. Most of the time, there was no news. But each time I logged on, I reminded myself that somewhere out there, someone was searching for me too. In those years, the lines between hope and exhaustion blurred. Yet technology gave me something I hadn't felt in decades: momentum. My son's photo, once confined to torn flyers on concrete walls, now lived in databases, on screens, in hearts across the country. His story was no longer lost. And even though I didn't know it then, the call that would change everything, the one I'd waited 3 decades to hear, was coming. It was a cold morning in the winter of 2020 when my phone rang. I almost didn't answer. Over the years, I'd grown used to wrong numbers, false leads, and scam calls that preyed on desperate parents. But something in the tone of the officer's voice made me stop. He asked my name, then quietly said, "We think we've found your son." For a few seconds, I couldn't speak. The world around me, the hum of traffic, the murmur of the TV in the background, disappeared. All I could hear was my heartbeat pounding in my ears. After 32 years of searching, those words didn't seem real. He told me a young man in another province had come forward to give a DNA sample as part of a national identification check. The results matched mine. My legs gave out, and I fell to the floor. I remember clutching the phone, repeating his name over and over, afraid that if I stopped saying it, he'd vanish again. The journey to meet him felt longer than all the years I'd spent searching. Volunteers and police officers accompanied me, but I barely noticed them. My hands trembled the entire way. What if it wasn't him? What if it was another cruel mistake? Or worse, what if he didn't want to see me? I'd imagined this reunion 1,000 times, but none of those fantasies prepared me for the weight of reality. When I finally saw him, standing in front of the police station, I didn't recognize him at first. He was taller than I'd imagined, with the quiet confidence of a man who had lived a full life. But when he smiled, I saw it, the same dimple, the same warmth I used to see when he was a little boy chasing dragonflies in the courtyard. My knees went weak. I called his name, and he froze. Then, slowly, he walked toward me. When he reached me, I touched his face, just to be sure he was real. For the first time in 32 years, I held my son. He told me he had grown up in a nearby province, raised by another family who had adopted him when he was just a toddler. They'd given him a new name, a new life. They hadn't known he'd been kidnapped, or at least, that's what he believed. They treated him well. He'd gone to school, worked, and built a life of his own. But deep down, he'd always felt something missing. When he learned about China's DNA reunification campaign, he decided to submit a sample, just in case. Our reunion wasn't the perfect ending I once imagined. He was kind but distant, unsure how to bridge a lifetime of separation. I couldn't blame him. He had two identities now, two mothers, two histories. I wanted to tell him everything, but the words tangled in my throat. I realized that while I had spent 3 decades searching for the past, he had spent those same decades building a future. We were strangers bound by blood and heartbreak. Still, there was peace in knowing, peace in seeing his face, hearing his voice, knowing he was alive and safe. We sat together that night, side by side, talking quietly. He told me he didn't remember much from before he was taken, only flashes of light, a woman calling his name, the smell of steamed rice. I told him that the woman was me. When the news of our reunion spread, people called it a miracle. They said it was proof that love never gives up, that persistence triumphs over time. And maybe they were right, but for me, it was something simpler. It was an ending, not a happy one, not a tragic one, just an ending. I had finally found him. As I left his city to return home, I looked out the train window and realized that the search had shaped my entire life. And though I had found what I was looking for, part of me would always belong to those empty years, the years defined by hope, by pain, and by a mother's refusal to stop believing. When news of our reunion spread, it moved far beyond my small town. Within days, reporters began calling. They wanted to know everything: how long I had searched, how I'd survived, how it felt to finally hold my son again. At first, I hesitated. For years, I had lived in silence, speaking only to other parents who understood the pain. But something inside me told me this story wasn't just mine anymore. It belonged to every mother still searching, every father still waiting at a train station with a photo in his pocket. My interview aired on national television a week later. They showed old footage of my search, the faded flyers, the crowded markets, the gray-haired woman walking alone with a backpack full of posters. Then they showed the moment I met my son. Viewers said they cried watching it. But more importantly, they started asking questions. How could this happen for so long? How many children were still missing? Who was responsible? For the first time, the country began to look closely at something it had ignored for decades. Journalists started digging into old records. Social media users shared stories of missing children, forming online communities that demanded answers. The truth was hard to swallow. Thousands of families had been torn apart under the shadow of the one-child policy, and the trafficking networks that profited from it had operated for years with little interference. My story, our story, had opened a wound the nation could no longer hide. Soon after, documentaries began to appear. Filmmakers followed parents still on the road, their faces weathered but their hope intact. My reunion was featured in one of them, and I watched from my small living room, tears streaming down my face as I saw myself on screen, older, fragile, but alive. I realized then that my pain had become a mirror for so many others. Public pressure grew. People demanded that the government strengthen child protection laws and expand the DNA database. And they did. In 2021, police announced new nationwide campaigns to combat child trafficking, vowing harsher sentences for traffickers and stricter monitoring of adoption records. Local governments began collecting DNA from both parents and children during routine medical checkups, creating a system that could identify stolen children more quickly. The change didn't happen overnight, but it happened. Technology, once out of reach for people like me, became the foundation of reform. The same internet that carried my son's photo to strangers' screens now carried accountability to those in power. The silence that once surrounded the missing had finally begun to break. But even as these reforms unfolded, I couldn't forget the parents who never got their reunion. I attended gatherings where hundreds of mothers and fathers came together, holding banners with their children's photos. Some were still waiting after 40 years. Others had lost hope but came anyway, because it felt better to grieve together than alone. Whenever they asked me how I found my son, I always said the same thing: don't stop searching. Technology can find DNA, but only love keeps the search alive. My story had become a spark, one that lit a movement across the country. Families who once searched in silence were now united, their voices echoing through every province, every city. And although I had found my son, I knew my role wasn't over. I began working with volunteer groups, helping other parents file DNA samples, teaching them how to use online databases, and speaking publicly about trafficking awareness. I had spent 32 years chasing one person. Now, I wanted to spend the rest of my life helping others do the same. My pain had found purpose, and for the first time in decades, I wasn't just a grieving mother, I was part of a national awakening. Even now, years after I found my son, I wake up some nights to the same old dream, a child's voice calling from far away, the sound fading before I can reach him. I sit up, look around my quiet home, and remind myself, he's here, he's safe. But the ache never truly leaves. Healing doesn't mean forgetting. It means learning to live with the memory of what was lost, and what was taken from so many others who never got their ending. My son and I meet often now. At first, it was awkward, like two strangers tied together by blood but separated by time. He had a different name, a different family, a different way of speaking. I learned that he had been sold to a couple in another province, raised as their only child. They were strict but kind, unaware of the truth until the police arrived. When we first met, he was quiet, unsure how to call me. I didn't blame him. How do you reclaim 32 lost years in one word, mother? Over time, we found a rhythm. We talk about small things, food, work, the weather. Sometimes, he asks about his childhood, about what he was like before he was taken. I tell him stories, not to remind him of what he missed, but to help him understand that he was always loved, even when he didn't know it. We don't talk much about the past. The wounds are still tender. But there's comfort in simply knowing he exists in my world again. Through all of this, I've come to realize that finding him didn't end my story, it transformed it. I no longer search train stations or pin flyers to walls, but I still travel, this time with purpose. I meet other parents, speak at schools, and work with organizations that help reunite families. I've seen hundreds of mothers finally embrace their children after decades apart, their cries echoing the same disbelief I once felt. Every reunion reminds me that love, even buried under years of pain, never dies. But for every story like mine, there are still thousands waiting. In remote villages and busy cities alike, parents continue their searches, fueled by the same desperate hope. I visit some of them when I can. I sit beside them, hold their hands, and remind them that miracles do happen, not always quickly, but often when least expected. And when I leave, I carry their faces with me. Their stories become part of my mission. The fight against child trafficking in China has come a long way. DNA databases, public awareness, and stricter laws have changed what once seemed unchangeable. But the roots of this tragedy, poverty, cultural pressure, and greed, still run deep. Change takes time, and it takes people who refuse to give up. I've learned that one voice can be ignored, but many voices together can shake a nation. Sometimes, when I walk through my old neighborhood, I see children playing in the streets, laughing freely, safely. Their parents watch nearby, unafraid. That sight alone feels like a victory. It's proof that what we lost wasn't in vain. Our suffering forced the world to look, to care, and to act. I no longer define my life by what was taken, but by what I found, strength, purpose, and the unbreakable bond between a mother and her child. My story is just one among thousands, but if it reminds even one parent not to give up, then every step, every flyer, every sleepless night was worth it. Because love, even when tested by decades of darkness, always finds its way home.